Open up the door, it's Dave! Who?
If you followed this channel for any length of time, you know that I started on a hydroponics adventure. My goal was to be able to grow fruits and vegetables and herbs through hydroponics right in my backyard. And it started off great. I was able to get some herbs going and things were going fairly well. But then I had two problems I had to overcome. The first had to do with the table itself that I was using. I was using an ebb and flow table. Basically, we would pump water off, it would drain back down, and the nutrient would get around the plants. The problem with it was that the drain was a little too high up, and sometimes water would get trapped on the table itself, and the roots would grow into the water and would then get waterlogged, and the plant would die. And this was something I was dealing with by draining it off every so often to make sure that it was completely dry. But it really didn't solve the problem. The second problem was the more insurmountable one. We had the roof redone on our house, and when we did, they unplugged the entirety of the hydroponic system, and I didn't notice for a couple of days, and by then the plants were beyond saving. So it's time to reinvent the hydroponic system. And this time I'm going to do it differently. I'm actually going to build a vertical hydroponic system that lets the water drain down completely, and I think I'm going to plug it into a solar battery so that way it won't have the problem of getting unplugged. And I'll monitor it using an app so that way I can keep control over it and make sure that it's always on. So join me as I get on this adventure. I'm at my local hardware store to pick up some of the components I need to get this process started. My end goal was to create a vertical hydroponics tower that looked like this. So what I needed were a few components. I needed a 4-inch PVC pipe that was about 5 feet long. I needed a 5-gallon bucket with a lid, some screws to hold the PVC pipe inside of the bucket, an end cap to put over the top of my PVC pipe, and then something to help distribute the water. The other thing I needed were some 3D printed parts that are net cup holders. Those are the things that protrude from the outside that are custom made to fit into a hydroponics tower like this. I started with a little bit of test fitting on putting the pipe inside the bucket. What I wanted to do was mark out where I wanted to put the holes to hold the whole thing together, and also to make sure I had an idea of how tall up it needed to be. One little thing I did that turned out to be a very important thing was making a mark on the bucket that was aligned with the UPC code on the pipe itself. That made it easier to go back and align everything after I took everything apart. So what I did was I drilled 4 holes into the bucket and then went through to the PVC pipe. My goal was to take some 4-inch screws, put them through there, and make sure that it was holding up something like you'd see a Christmas tree that's held up in a stand. So I'm putting 4 holes in here, making sure that they go through, and then I'm going to put the screws in to hold it upright. So conceptually, it's really easy. Actually making it work was a little bit harder, and it took me a little more effort than I thought it was going to kind of put this together. I thought this is kind of trivial, it should be easy enough to do this. But it turned out that I had to actually take it out a couple of times and refit it to make it work. It was just about stability. That was really what it came down to. So I kept moving it around until I found that it was fairly stable and it felt like it was going to stay together. You want it to be tight enough so that it doesn't feel like it's going to fall over at any point in time. The weight of the water in the bucket will keep the bucket stable, but you want to make sure that the pipe is stable too. Now, next up was to start thinking about how I wanted to put my net cup holders on the outside of it. And here's where a little geeky math came in handy. I wanted to figure out what the circumference was on the outside of the pipe. So I measured it out and figured out that we're at about 4.5 inches going across. So if I realize the circumference is 2 pi r, and I know that the radius is about 2.25, then I can do the calculation and figure out that the circumference should be 2 times 3.14, which is pi, times 2.25, and that gives me a circumference of 14.13 inches going around. Now, to just validate that this is correct, I went ahead and measured it, and look at that. It is 14.13 inches, approximately anyway. And now comes the fun part of figuring out where to put the holes exactly. What I wanted to do was put 27 holes in my pipe that would then be the places where plants could grow. So I figured out that I wanted to have 9 rows, with 3 holes in each row, offset so that they were in slightly different places and the water wasn't just flowing straight up and down. That way I could use my space efficiently. To do this, I was going to have the rows be about 5 inches apart from each other, and that way I could get down to the bottom and still have a little room. And here's where the geeky part of getting the circumference comes back in. I realized that if I broke the pipe up into 6 sections, it would be easy to mark off where each one of the holes would be. So what I did is I took a piece of paper, I cut it to 14.13 inches, made each one of the segments 2.3 inches wide, drew a line for each one of the segments, numbered them 1 through 6. What I did is at the top, between sections 1 and 2, I made an X. Between 3 and 4, I made an X. And between 5 and 6, I made an X. On the bottom, it's between 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And it will also be between 6 and 1 when I fold it around. So then all I had to do was find the starting point I wanted to do, make a mark for that first top spot, make a mark for the second top spot, make a mark for the third top spot. Then I could go to the bottom and do the same thing. Then I could just keep moving it down the pipe all the way down until I got to the bottom, and I would have 27 marks where I would want my holes to be, and it would be perfectly aligned to what I wanted to do. And now comes the fun part of actually cutting. I took a 1-inch hole cutter that I had and started cutting holes where each of the marks was. I went down the pipe and cut all 27 holes the same way. The only downside was that it was a little bit of a tedious process to do this, primarily because each time I made a cut, I had to stop, take the drill bit off, and take the PVC piece that I had cut out, and take it out of the bit and set it aside. But once I was done, I had 27 perfectly drilled holes that I could use for my hydroponics. I went ahead and just sanded them down to make it a little bit neater. The other thing I wanted to do was cut a hole in the top lid. Now I'm using the lid primarily to make sure that no debris falls into the bucket and that I don't have so much evaporation. So I just marked out where I wanted to have the center point, roughly speaking, and then cut that hole to make sure that it went around. So I just marked it and then drilled through it one time with the 1-inch drill bit, and then used a jigsaw to finish it out to make sure that I had cut it out. Was it a perfect hole? No. But does it matter? Not really. The goal was to just make sure I had a hole that was the right size that the pipe could fit through. I could certainly jam something in there to make it fit and make it perfectly round, so that way it accomplishes what I want. But there you go. It's a little bit off center, but good enough. So I did a little test fit, everything's good, and I'm ready to go. Now the other thing is there's a lot of debris, so you got to clean up constantly. Now the other thing I wanted to do was make sure that my pump would fit at the bottom. So I set it at the bottom and then ran my hose down and connected it up. All right, now comes the fun part of trying to assemble. I had test assembled my entire design, and I was playing around with it for a while and tried to get the whole thing to come together. And I wasn't happy with the way it was coming out. It felt very loose to me. It felt like the whole thing was just going to fall over at any point in time. I kept trying different things. I bought some drywall anchors to try and see if maybe I could use those to my advantage. I tried a whole bunch of different things and wasn't happy with the way this was coming together. It just wasn't working for me. What I wound up doing was putting a knockout in there, taking one of the pieces that I'd knocked out, putting on the outside of the pipe to help hold it in place. So the head of the screw is on the inside facing out rather than trying to screw something in. The problem was it was hard to attach to it. Now, as far as draining the water from the top, what I got was this electrical cap that's made of PVC. And I just drilled a bunch of holes in it. One to put the plumbing that goes through the top, and then a bunch of holes that'll let the water drain back through. And I glued it onto the top of my PVC pipe. Now when I put it together, it should work out pretty well. Next up is adding these net cup holders. The way I decided to do this was to actually mark them out to make sure that I knew exactly where they were going to go, so the net cup would actually fall in there to the right place. And then I proceeded to glue them all in. This took probably about an hour to accomplish. I was just going along and gluing each one of these on there. But as you can see, it's well worth the effort as I'm going through it, just to make sure they're in the right place and everything holds together, and it worked out pretty well. It took a little effort to find the right glue, too, to make sure that everything was going to hold the way I wanted it to. But at the end, you can see how well it came together. I had bought net pot holders. There were 27 in the package. 26 of them were perfect and fit around the PVC just fine. But one was flat and not bent properly. So I Googled around a little bit and figured out that because it's a 3D printed material, they're actually fairly malleable. All you have to do is take some hot water and then use your fingers to kind of manipulate them a little bit to bend them ever so slightly. So that's exactly what I did. And lo and behold, it worked out perfectly. Now the last part was getting my pump hooked up. What I wanted to do was have the whole thing working outside without having to worry about running electricity. So I got myself a solar powered battery, then plugged it into a wireless connector. So that way I could turn the power on and off to the pump remotely and actually have it on a schedule so it would come on several times a day. I put that underneath the bucket, connected it up to the solar, filled up with my bucket with water, and started it running. Here we can test it out just by turning it on, and you can see the water flows beautifully through it. It's perfect as far as that goes. It's splashing out a little bit, so I'm going to have to adjust the pressure just a little, but you get the idea that how easy this is to work with. The water is just flowing right down from the top. I ran the plumbing up through it. It's just sprinkling out through the top, through that little plastic cap that I put on there, and makes it go. Now what I'm going to do is create my nutrient-rich solution. I'll pour that into my bucket. I've made a hole in the top just to make this easy. Now, as far as the plants I wanted to use, one of the plants I was thinking about, I was growing this little tomato plant in a pot here. So all I wanted to do was take it out of the pot, put it into one of the net cup holders, and let it start taking off on its own. But overall, you can see how the solar panel is set up. I have my battery that's connected to it, plus my wireless connector, and everything is up and running. And that's it. There's the hydroponic tower. It seems to be going pretty well. Everything seems to have come together with it. I was able to get the last piece attached as the net cup holder. At this point, I have 2 plants planted in it, but I'll add more as time goes on. I'll find some other plants I want to add. I'll go ahead and start growing some in rock wool and get some seeds germinated and start to build up that way. It turns out this was a pretty easy build. It just took some time to kind of get it all together. It really wasn't very hard at all, but once it came together, it was pretty straightforward. I'm very happy with the way it's working out.
What's your point, David?